First, as you've been hearing, there was a blow to the airlines industry and to those Irish customers hoping to avail of low-cost flights to the United States as Norwegian Airlines announced the cancellation of transatlantic routes from Ireland. After a decision by the airline to shut its Dublin-based routes from Dublin, Cork and Shannon to New York, Boston and Toronto will be finished by September 15. So could this be the end of low-cost transatlantic flight from Ireland? The editor of Travel Extra, Eoghan Corry, is on the line. Eoghan, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
Now, first of all, I suspect you were not too surprised at the departure of Norwegian Air.
It was a question of how much they could take, what sort of pummeling they could take financially. They've had a run of really, really bad luck on these routes. And the questions this morning are not really whether the model is sustainable, but how long will the bigger guys and the other forces, political forces, allow anybody who is trying to initiate the low-cost market, which is what Norwegian were doing, how long they'd be allowed to get away with it.
Now, the Ryanair EasyJet low-cost model, which works on short haul, the whole idea is to keep the aircraft in the air for as many hours of the 24 as you possibly can. When you're going transatlantic with longer flight times, the equation becomes more difficult.
Yes, you're absolutely that. Pretty fundamental is the 20-25 minute turnaround of aircraft. That's what Southwest initiated, Pat, in the late 80s, early 90s. And that's what Michael O'Leary saw in his visits to North America and said, this is the future for it. But what we've seen the last 4 or 5 years is those low-cost sectors getting a little bit longer. It's quite interesting to see 4 or 5 hour sectors. The most familiar to our listeners here this morning would be Canary Island sectors, and some of those come from Norway, which are the same distance as transatlantic. It was a big battle, by the way, a lot of casualties before low cost managed to survive in Europe, and it was really one of the great things that the European Union have done for us. But while a lot of people have looked at this transatlantic, the people who've ventured into it, and we go all the way back to the likes of Freddie Laker here, have generally, people will remember flying from Shannon in the 90s. They've always come a cropper. What Norwegian managed to do, technology had moved on. They were looking at what the Boeing 737 can do, and they were one of the first to exploit Ireland's geographical location to open up those airports on the east side of North America. Obviously, you couldn't fly into JFK, it would cost too much. So they discovered Stewart International, beautifully positioned for the Irish, because so many Irish people live up there near them in places like Rye and Blauvelt and Pearl River. That was something that probably paid them, that they hadn't factored in to be such a part of the success. They also looked at Providence as serving as the sort of alternative to Boston. Less successful. I think the Irish bought Newburgh as being New York, even though it was 2 hours away. Less anxious to buy Providence as Toronto, and they flew in as Boston. And as you say, they've opened up Toronto quite recently, flying into the Hamilton Airport, the second airport in Toronto. But the problems really were, the whole thing would have been structured as a very, very small margin, very, very tight margin, very small profit on every seat.
Okay, so for people who haven't flown Norwegian Air, and I have not, the idea was that if you arrived with your knapsack that could fit over the seat, the fare was very low. If, on the other hand, you had 2 trunks that you wanted to put in the hold, the fare escalated.
Not your airline if you had 2 trunks for the whole patch, you have it in one. And the Irish are being very, very well trained by low-cost airlines, mainly Ryanair, because they've chased everyone outside of our market. But we've been very well trained to travel. So what the Norwegian people told me a little bit in advance of this announcement was that maybe they pitched that lead-in fare too low, and their expectation of ancillary, which is not just the bag in the hold, but the cups of coffee, all the other things you sell, maybe they expected a little bit higher yield. they found that Irish customers in particular were very, very good at getting everything into one bag, bringing their own sandwiches and not spending a cent more than their lead-in fare.
By the way, as an aside, recently having flown Ryanair several times, they don't gouge you on price for their in-cabin food and drinks. I mean, they also conscious that you can buy a sandwich in the airport or in your local deli or make it yourself. And their food offering is competitive.
Their food offering is competitive. In fact, the recent results, the Q1 results from Ryanair, which showed that their profit was down 20%. It showed these enormous gains in ancillary sales, and they are, I think, one of the biggest panini sellers in Europe. When you put all their flights into the sky and the number of them that are sold, it could be that the panini is the salvation of Ryanair as other things start going wrong with them. But you're absolutely right. They've it took a while to reach the price level, but they do see their captive audience as being able to generate quite a lot in ancillary revenue without gouging them.
So Norwegian Air got that wrong. Their lead-in fare too low, and their revenue from ancillaries did not materialise to the extent that they might have expected. That's one thing that kind of made their margins tight, but they were creating a profit, weren't they?
They were, and the profit was very low. The other thing that went against them a little bit was Providence didn't perform as well as Stewart International did. These are all small facts. These are all what you'd expect with the first year or two of an airline, and they're not major problems. The routes were profitable enough to sustain them, even when they pulled out of Belfast a little bit earlier this year, because the air passenger duty just made Belfast even without it, even when it was abolished, the Belfast market wasn't sustainable. But they had come across a series of hurdles which nobody could have anticipated, Pat. There is the law, the legals are all in place for an open skies agreement between the United States and Europe. It should have been very easy to open up a service from Dublin, Cork, Shannon to the United States, but they were delayed for 2 years, in which time they spent something like 8 to 10 million euro just keeping their operation going by an unholy alliance of pilot unions and political forces and the incumbent airlines in North America. It's quite interesting that the North American or the United States culture isn't regarded as very pro-union. It's regarded as hostile to unions, but they all got together on this, basically because they saw the arrival of this low-cost upstart as a threat to their North Atlantic ventures, which are highly profitable, and the pilots were also looking at terms. So that slowed them down for 2 years. And of course, the big item that they instanced in their statement yesterday is the grounding of the Boeing 737 MAX.
Now, how many of those did they have in service at the time of the grounding?
They didn't have a lot. They had about 20, I think it was 19 of them in service at the time of the grounding. It was a reasonable proportion of their fleet. It put them under pressure, but what it definitely did was put the Irish operation under a lot of pressure.
Just before you go on, I am convinced, and I'm sure it's going to be proven by events, that Boeing are going to have to compensate everybody that was affected by the grounding of the 747 MAX, and that will include costs incurred in replacing those aircraft on a temporary basis, which is what Norwegian Air had to do. So you'd imagine that's a bankable kind of thing, that you could go to your lenders and say, look, we have a big pot of money coming from Boeing very shortly once they get this aircraft in the air and we all do our reconciliations. So why would that not have been bankable and allowed them to go forward?
Because the lenders are volatile. We have another Norwegian situation, which was that they'd grown very fast, very similar to what Ryanair had done, and they had got a considerable market share, but they didn't really have the cash reserves to sustain it. They had a suggestion of a takeover by Willie Walsh, IAG, in the autumn. Another takeover contender arrived, or financier arrived in December. I spoke to Willie Walsh about this in January. He said that he wasn't interested in a bidding war, and sure as his word, a few days later he pulled out. The second financier failed to deliver. So Norwegian were now left with all the vultures looking at them, running out of cash, very, very good market share, unlikely to go under, but more likely to be a takeover target, but everybody waiting for them to bleed a little bit more. And when you're bleeding, it doesn't matter whether you have a tiny business or a large business, finance terms become more difficult. And crucially in aviation, hedging of fuel, it's a big deal. It saves you from shocks of very sudden rises. You don't get the same terms as the big guys sitting on a lot of cash like Ryanair and EasyJet do. So all of those things were bubbling away in the background. And you're absolutely right, Boeing have put a charge in their results announced just about 10 days ago of the amount of compensation that they expect to pay. But how long are we going to be waiting for that? With lenders who are already, tapping their feet on the ground, saying, "Come on, you're in trouble. Give us, we're going to make your terms, your credit terms, more uncomfortable for you." So all of those things were blowing around in the background. Their solution to the grounding the MAX was not ideal. They closed their Cork and Dublin services temporarily. It's turned out to be permanent. They bused people to Dublin. They put them on an A330, and they also brought people from Newburgh to other destinations. So they had this. They ended up being a legacy airline with a big wide-body aircraft, still charging their Challenger brand prices. And I suspect a small trickle of money that they were losing, we don't know the figures, turned into a bit of a torrent. The CEO departed about 3 weeks ago, the guy who founded the airline, seen the dream and done so much for low-cost aviation in Europe. It was very sad. And the new guys came in and said one of the things they must have looked at is the Irish operation and said, this is not sustainable without the MAX.
Yeah. Now tell me, is the rest of the Norwegian Air operation secure with the stripping away of the Irish routes?
The Irish routes were a separate entity that would have been possibly financial advice or to ring fence an Irish operation in case it ran into trouble. The rest of Norwegian is secure. It's losing money though, Pat, and the losses are about 20-30, not enormous, but they are talking. This is an airline that's built itself on growth, the sort of growth that Ryanair would have prided itself on, 3, 4, 5, 6%. Ryanair's would sometimes be higher than that, quite a lot higher than that. But they've now talked about contracting, and they're talking about reducing frequencies, bringing it down, not by much, but they are ambling along. But all those lurking background suggestions about them running out of cash are all there. The rumour mill of aviation, and it's an industry that loves its rumours, was full of Norwegian over the last few months. The demise, and listeners will remember, WOW Air came onto the Irish market with €99 fares to North America via Keflavik, and that put another question on the viability of the market, and Norwegian were more or less in the same game on the transatlantic. So it really is a question of confidence from the financial community not being the highest. But what they were doing at the passenger end was the opposite. They shifted a huge amount of passengers. They were very successful. 242,000 a year out of Dublin, 82,000 out of Shannon, 28,000 out of Cork. And a lot of noise about the Cork routes because they'd never had a transatlantic before. But the numbers are really doing what every other transatlantic airline into Ireland is doing, and putting their services and frequencies into Dublin.
Okay. This text, really sorry to see Norwegian's routes go. I've been able to visit family in New York, so much more. A long weekend trip over was feasible with flights at €200, and the same for them coming this way. We saw a lot more of them. So one of the impacts of Norwegian was that the legacy carriers had to drop their fares and offer packages. That presumably will stop, and the fares will creep up again with Aer Lingus and the others. So for those who had booked Norwegian, who now won't be able to travel Norwegian after September 15, they have to rebook, and presumably at much higher prices.
You've hit it. I just to follow up with your texter said Norwegian created a terrific market, and I travelled on it, and I was sitting beside students who would probably have to travel, wait 2 years to go. They were actually heading over for weekends, and it landed so close to Woodbury Common it wasn't funny. We had day trippers leaving Dublin in the morning and flying Norwegian to Newburgh into Woodbury Common and back. So they had changed that dynamic. So it would be lovely to see someone else picking that up. People who've booked they're up to 2 weeks before the flight, you can cancel on the terms that you just itemised. We'll offer you a reroute via Norwegian services. There are Norwegian transatlantic services through Gatwick, which is a separate operation, and they also can offer a refund. Aer Lingus, interestingly enough, reacted not just to Norwegian but to WOW as well, with this no bag fare on transatlantic, on certain selected transatlantic routes, and that really was the big indication of how the legacy carriers were reacting to this €99 one-way fare, and they were all looking at it saying, okay, we can offer something similar, and I suspect that some of the others looked at it as well and didn't go ahead with it. You're absolutely right. When the entry-level fare is abolished, which is what's happening here, all the fares will float up a little bit. It'd be interesting to see how much they float up, but there's quite a lot of competition in transatlantic anyway, and I would expect that flying in winter will still be quite reasonable. Summer will be a completely different question. Summer 2020 comes round, especially if there's no more growth out of Dublin Airport, we could see higher prices.
All right, Eoghan Corry, editor of TravelExtra.ie. Eoghan, thank you very much for joining us.